the war was still going on, and it was at that point still going on, you do not analyze every single detail of what appears to be a military threat. You simply employ your force. So I got a lot of criticism for that, and again, that probably toughened my hide and thickened my skin, because you have to defend your reporting, you have to explain why you did what you did, and you have to also accept that when you report on contentious matters, you're going to upset people.
Looking back, do you see this as the big break for Stephen Sackur? This is what, this was the one big story that you've been waiting for, and you finally got it.
Well, there is an element of truth in that. It certainly raised my reporting profile back in Britain. But I'm very wary of sort of saying that, because there's an element in journalism that is callous and selfish and sort of talks about big stories and great stories. And that sounds so wrong, when actually what we're discussing here is something that was tragic and that involved the loss of hundreds and hundreds of lives. So to say, oh, well, was that your big break? Just frankly, it sounds wrong, and so I've never really felt that way about it. What has lived with me from that much more is this sense of coming to terms with just how terrible war could be.
You wrote a book about that.
Yeah, I did. Well, the book was called On the Basra Road, and it was a series of recollections from my time in the Middle East, and that was at the front of it, because it really left a huge mark on me. And there's one other thing which I should say about it, which is sort of relevant. I'd gone back to the Middle East with my wife. We were newly married, and my wife was Iraqi. Well, she's half Lebanese, half Iraqi, and she had obviously a lot of family in Iraq, and her family had been forced out of the country by Saddam Hussein, which was just part of her family history. But it just meant there was a strong personal connection with the region. I cared about Iraq, and I knew a little bit about Iraq, which went beyond sort of professional journalism, just from my own wife's family story. So again, it just added to the sense that this story, more than any other I covered in my early career, made a huge mark on me. Yeah.
Did it leave you with emotional scars? Would you say? Did you have to?
No. I mean, it's a fair question, because I have a lot of colleagues who have seen terribly traumatic things and have struggled with it and have needed counselling and have, in essence, suffered some sort of post-traumatic stress. I don't think I did. I mean, I remember I had a few bad nights and woke up with images in my head at the time, but that wore off pretty quickly. And of all the stories I've covered around the world, and I've seen some horrible things, I think I've found that I could cope. I've got mechanisms to help me cope with it.
And then maybe this is actually what makes you be a very good host for Hard Talk, where you sit across somebody and you can put them in their place. There have been moments, I'm sure, when you've been put in your place.
Yeah, of course. I mean, any interview is a very dynamic exchange, and you never quite know what you're going to get. And there's always a particular chemistry in the room. There's a chemistry now. There always is. And sometimes it's a good chemistry, and sometimes it's a horrible chemistry. And particularly because of the nature of my show, where I'm trying to dig a little bit deeper, and sometimes I'm trying to go places where interviewees don't particularly want me to go. There are times when I'm challenging them with information which I believe to be true, or at least what my researchers and myself have discovered about a particular issue, and my interviewee tells me I've just got it dead wrong, and then rather effectively proves that I've got it dead wrong. And it has happened. I'm only as good as the research that I do and that my team does. And I wouldn't pretend that 100% of the time things go entirely according to plan. I mean, I live or die by my credibility and the strength of my research and the strength of my sort of editorial judgment. So I hope, 99% of the time I get it right, but
sometimes you don't. What's the best interview that you had? What's your most, the one that you felt went exceedingly well?
Yeah, well, There have been a lot. Actually, one that comes to mind that is relevant to this region is an interview I did a while ago, actually probably 6 or 7 years ago, with Prime Minister Meles Zenawi in Ethiopia, who, I don't know if you've ever had him on your show, but I mean, was, of course, recently sadly died, but was a very tough, single-minded, icy interviewee, and we had a really tough old exchange. But there were just 1 or 2 moments when I really felt that I'd sort of gotten under his skin. I'd revealed a side to his character that he didn't necessarily want to reveal, and it was particularly, in relation to his treatment of students, of some people in the press, some of the more repressive aspects of his leadership, which we really had a go at and led to a fascinating exchange. You can imagine.
It was fiery.
It was fiery. Oh yeah. I'm trying to think. There've only been a couple of interviews where the handshake hasn't happened. Only one interview where the guest just quit after 7 or 8 minutes and certainly didn't hang around for the handshake. But that's very, very unusual.
You recently interviewed Yoweri Museveni, the president of Uganda.
Yeah.
And you had a long chat with him regarding his journey in the past 25 years as president of Uganda.
That's right.
Young Museveni who stormed into Kampala saying he wants to change leadership. And now you're putting him in the spot and asking him whether he's still the same man.
That's right.
And Museveni says, I am still the same man.
Yeah.
What did you make of that?
Well, I enjoyed the Museveni interview because he's still got some fire in his belly. He's still a man of passion. And also I kind of like the fact that he's prepared to say things which, perhaps some Western leaders would think were impolitic. He's prepared to talk like a genuine Ugandan who has strong feelings. And I'm thinking now about the discussion we had about, sort of gender politics and the issues of sexuality, which, are a very hot topic in Uganda. And he wasn't sort of trying to dress up his language in a way to be...
He put it out there.
He put it out there.
In fact, he said that the Western countries are trying to impose culture on Africa.
It was a very interesting discussion. And, listen, it's not my job, and I think, everybody watching this will appreciate it. It's not my job to judge people, and I really try not to be judgmental, and I don't want to sound like this guy who thinks he knows it all or has got preconceived ideas of what's right and wrong. My job is just to ask really interesting questions. And I just felt what I liked about Museveni was that he was prepared to give me interesting answers. There are a lot of politicians, I dare say in Kenya, but around the world, who have been trained in how not to be interesting, how to avoid controversy, how to say things which offend. Yeah, exactly. Bland. Let's be bland. Let's avoid controversy, and let's not make trouble for ourselves. Well, I don't think Museveni's been to that school of PR training. He just sort of says what he feels.
What do you make of the Western world's view of Africa, especially in terms of when it comes to this sexuality debate? Museveni was saying he feels that the Western countries are coming down on Africa and saying this is how you should view this issue. And he's saying we have had homosexuals all our lives. The issue is how to expose it, how to handle it.
Yeah.
And he feels that the Western countries are pushing down.
He does say that, and it's a fascinating argument about sort of cultural imperialism, Western cultural imperialism, against the notion that there are some absolute values, universal values when it comes to the rights of individuals, whether it be on issues of sexual politics or the role of women in society, or a host of other things you could think of. And this is relevant not just in Africa, but in the Middle East and Asia. I think we in the West have to, first of all, we have to be very aware that our worldview is very much a Western worldview. But equally, I think people around the world, and I'm thinking now about reaction to the Arab Spring, have to think very carefully about the notion of some basic universal rights, a right to say what you believe, free expression, a right to have a genuine say in the politics of your countries through some form of democratic process, and a right, to live as an individual able to express your innermost sort of feelings, whether you're a man or a woman, whether you're classically heterosexual or not. Where do we draw the lines? Where are universal values actually not universal values? I don't have answers, but I do think these are legitimate questions, and I don't think that they are all questions which only derive from a Western mindset. I think they're questions which Kenyans and Ugandans and many other peoples in the developing world would regard as very important. The answers might be somewhat different, but the questions are legitimate.
Has any interviewee ever put it to you that maybe you are planted to come and talk down on them or come and drive a certain Western agenda?
Well, yeah, you do get that. I'd say that's a classic sort of defense mechanism from some politicians who want to portray themselves as defenders of a sort of particular nationalistic trend or cultural view. I'm not particularly impressed by it because I think it's an easy way to win populist support without really having an argument behind it. But I would also say I'm not only accused, by some of my guests in the developing world of having a prejudged mindset. I remember one interview, perhaps one of the most contentious interviews I did, was a while ago with Al Gore, when he accused me of bringing a prejudged mindset to the interview on the issue of climate change. He claimed that I was part of a conspiracy to undermine his case that, man-made global warming is threatening the planet. He said I'd clearly been bought by the skeptics. And I resented that just as much as I would resent people saying that I'm a Western imperialist. I genuinely try not to bring preconceived ideas to the table in terms of my questions. I try to look very carefully at the evidence.
You say you stick to the issue?
I stick to the issue, stick to the evidence, and try to dig under my guests' particular sort of positions and record. I try to look at their record and what they've done and find areas where it might be vulnerable or it might need a challenge. But I don't do it because I've got a whole bunch of preconceived ideas, because I think that would be absolutely the wrong role for me to play.
Let's bring this back home a little bit. And in the last couple of days, you've been interviewing some Kenyan leaders.
Yeah.
We've seen an interview with the Deputy Prime Minister, Musalia Mudavadi. We're heading into an election next year. And I'm sure that's why you're talking to these leaders.
Well, it's an interesting time in Kenya, that's for sure, yeah.
I'm sure that's why you're talking to them. What kind of vibe are you getting from them?
Well, I'm getting a vibe which I think is a mix of apprehension that it could be a very tense election season.
From the leaders or from the public?
Well, I think from the public, first and foremost. The leaders always try to sound as though, they're in control and that the situation will be fine as long as they get plenty of votes. I think the public is apprehensive, and I think there's a mix of that sort of sense of fear, but also a sense of opportunity. I mean, there's no question, I haven't been to Nairobi for at least a couple of years, and I can just see and sense that, there's an economic change in the air. You've got impressive growth, maybe not as good as you'd like, but the country's changing, Africa's changing. There are opportunities out there, I think, that you in East Africa can really see now. And so it could be a great decade coming up for Kenya, but only if you can avoid the sorts of infighting and communal violence and conflict that you saw in 2007-8, and you've got to find a way of avoiding that.
Do you plan on talking to maybe an ordinary Kenyan on your show?
Yeah.
You only talk to.
Yeah, you're right.
Karua, Uhuru Kenyatta, Musalia Mudavadi, Odinga.
Yeah.
Talk to Eric Latif. Let him tell you something.
Well, you're not. If I were looking for the typical ordinary Kenyan, I'm not sure I'd go to you first. I mean, you've got your own TV show. You're a media player. You're somebody in the public domain. I take your point. I think it's very important that we outside journalists get a sense of what ordinary Kenyans are feeling right now. And we at the BBC do that, and as we have a lot of reporters here in Nairobi, both English language and also working in local languages, and so therefore the BBC is doing it. My job at Hard Talk really is to do the public figures. You know, we don't tend to go and vox pop ordinary citizens because that happens elsewhere.